this presentation, this project, is that actual intelligence and additional capabilities derived from the data that can then be used in really incredible ways to make a huge difference and save wildlife. And second reason I'm really excited is because I played a very small part in this, which was a lot of fun, and I enjoyed it. But I had the privilege and the pleasure of working with these four incredible women, and look forward to continuing to work with all of you. So with that, we'll introduce Corinne from North Carolina Zoo, Andrea from African Parks in Kafui, Andrea from MoveApps, and Xia from Panthera in Kafui.
All right, so my name is Corinne Kendall. I'm based at North Carolina Zoo, and I've been studying vultures since 2008. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how we've been using vulture movement for real-time use on the ground. And hopefully there's context both for additional use of vultures in this way, but also of additional use of the tools that we'll be talking about that have allowed us to take that analysis and utilize it in real time in EarthRanger. So I probably don't need to talk too much about vultures to this group, but vultures are amazing scavengers. They are incredibly efficient soarers, which allows them to travel over huge distances. So they often end up telling us about more than one park, even when we've tagged them with the intent of looking in one place. They are the primary scavenger in an African context, and in the Mara-Serengeti ecosystem, they can consume up to 70% of all the available carrion. So they're playing a really important role in terms of disease control, but they're also just a really interesting species in terms of the way they function. Unfortunately, vultures are in a lot of trouble. So the African vulture crisis was recognized almost 10 years ago, and we've seen that there are rapid declines throughout Africa. One of the biggest issues for vultures is poisoning. This usually involves the use of pesticides on a carcass, and there's a couple different motivations for this. So one is retaliatory killing. So we've heard a lot about human-wildlife coexistence and conflict, but that can also lead to killing of vultures. So if a lion kills a cow like this, someone might go and sprinkle pesticides on that cow. That leads to the death of the lion, but also to the death of a lot of vultures. Another motivation is sentinel poisoning. So poachers have recognized that rangers are using vultures to find carcasses. That movement of vultures taking off and landing and soaring is very indicative of where a dead animal is. And so unfortunately, that's led to a few instances where ivory poachers have laced carcasses with pesticides. In those cases, you're talking about hundreds of birds, 400 or 500 in some of the worst situations. So that has a huge impact on them. And then increasingly, we're seeing more trade in vulture body parts, so killing them for the vultures themselves, so using the heads and the feet, which are sold for traditional medicine. So poisoning is a problem that affects vultures, but it's a problem that affects a lot of different species. It's a big issue for carnivores, and so it's something that we really want to understand in a variety of ecosystems. And it's an illegal activity, so it often goes unnoticed because it might only be happening once or twice a year, but even in that small frequency, it can have a big impact. So we started tagging vultures. Most recently, I'm going to talk about our work in Tanzania, and then we'll get into the work in Zambia as well. But we started tagging vultures with the intent of being able to find out where these poisonings are happening, to, as much as possible, have a real-time alert where you'd be able to get to the poisoning quickly and perhaps save some birds or better dispose of the carcass so that you don't have additional poisonings. And we've also been able to use the telemetry to understand where poisoning is happening, where the hotspots are, what are the motivations, because it's so different depending on where you are. So they've been very useful from that. But we've also started using vultures as real-time indicators of carcasses as well. So in Tanzania, we started studying vultures actually in 2013, and then we began tagging them in 2015. We've worked in Ruaha Katavi, and then all the way over to Salunarary ecosystem. And North Carolina Zoo, with our partners, have tagged 62 vultures over the last 7-8 years, with 14 currently active tags. We've really focused on white-backed vultures because they're most frequently using large carcasses, so they're going to be your best indicator for poaching, but they're also a really good indicator for poisoning because they're ranging inside and outside of a protected area. The units that we use are microwave telemetry. They're fantastic. They last 2 to 5 years, and they're solar powered, so give us a lot of information on a single bird. We use a mortality signal to look at poisoning, and we use clustering to look at carcasses. I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail. So the main tool that we've used for the mortality alerts has been MoveBank. MoveBank is an amazing tool. There's a lot of different things you can do with it. It's great for data sharing. It's a nice place to archive your data. It's compatible with a lot of different telemetry types, so you can have your telemetry data download directly into it. So what we do is we have our satellite Argos data come into MoveBank, and then we get automated emails that tell us about when there might have been a mortality event. And in addition, MoveBank also is a good conduit for bringing movement data into EarthRanger. So the mortality alerts for us, for many other species, you might use immobility as an indication of mortality, but vultures can sit on a nest for several days. They can sit at a carcass for a long time. So you really need another measure in order to understand how they're doing. So the units that we have an activity sensor built into them. It's a very simple tool. It just basically moves up from 0 to 255, so it's a little counter. And that count, we should always be seeing the number changing. The number itself doesn't really mean anything, but the number should be changing if the bird is alive. So that's what we're using to check. So with the MoveBank emails, we get a subset of the data if we want to take a quick peek at where the birds are. We get info on when the unit last received data, which is useful for making sure the tags themselves are still working. We get a little bit of information about how the bird's doing, how far it traveled, and we have a mortality alert that's based off of distance traveled. But that's sort of the first step, so we use that to then decide, okay, do I need to take some time to look at the activity sensor information as well? We also get battery life in this, which gives us a sense of, again, kind of the unit and how it's doing. So that's been sort of the first phase, is looking at mortality and identifying poisoning. The second phase has been thinking about carcass detection. And I think we've really only scratched the surface with this. So we've been using this in combination with law enforcement, working with TANAPA, TAWA, WCS, and Frankfurt Zoological Society. We've been able to find disease outbreaks, and then there's potential to look at a lot of other things. You can find predator kills based on vulture movement. You can learn a lot about vulture foraging ecology. And I think there's even potential to use this to understand prey mortality rates, at least for some of the larger mammal species. So in Tanzania in the last 7 years, we've found 6 large poisoning incidents that killed sort of 20 or more birds. Most of those were related to retaliatory killings. Someone who'd lost a cow and put pesticides out onto the carcass. But we also had a case of sentinel poisoning not tied to ivory poaching, but tied to bushmeat snaring. So there were huge snare lines, and I'm sure the vultures come and both eat what people are trying to catch, but they're also alerting rangers by landing and taking off along these snare lines. So in this case, poachers had pulled off a piece of meat, and they killed 100 vultures that were coming on and off of these snares. So that's the first time we've seen that, another motivation for killing vultures that we need to be aware of. In terms of carcass detection, we were originally using an ArcGIS custom Python tool that we had built that allows us to pull out clusters. We look at clusters not just of a single individual, but across individuals. The more vultures that are out of spot, the more indicative it might be of where they're feeding. And so we use this to find feeding events. This has allowed us to detect over 500 carcasses in the Ruaha-Katabi New Salute ecosystem. And the Wildlife Conservation Society has said that this has become the most effective way for them to find elephant carcasses. And it's helped to lead to identification of poaching patterns as things move around the park, to arrests and to ivory seizures. In addition, it's been very useful in Salou Nueri ecosystem for identifying major snare lines, where that seems to be a pretty frequent activity. And then we've even been able to use it to detect disease outbreaks. So we had 2 anthrax outbreaks in Tanzania in 2017. The first one was very small, and we detected it early. And the Tanzanian National Parks was able to actually go out and destroy the carcasses and prevent that from spreading. The second one was during the dry season, and it was much larger, and so it spread farther, but we were able to use the birds to kind of track where it was going as it moved from one hippo pool to the next. So in terms of thinking about this system, there's a lot of potential to use this kind of tracking in other settings. One of the first questions that I usually get is, how many birds do you need to tag? So I have a PhD student, Natasha Peters, who just finished her PhD at University of York, working with myself and Colin Beale. And she did a linear discriminant analysis to understand our effectiveness at finding carcasses. So of the ground truth points that we'd had about 88% accuracy in identifying this is a carcass versus this was a roost or something else. And for elephants, we had about 78% in terms of identifying of those carcasses, which one is likely to be an elephant. So this is a really accurate system that can be very effective even across a large landscape. She also utilized a mark recapture analysis to understand how many carcasses there might be within the landscape based on the way vultures were using the carcasses. And from that, she was able to estimate that you only need 4 to 6 tags in an area that the birds are using regularly. So that's always the caveat of where are the birds choosing to go. But if they're hanging out a lot in your protected area, you only need 4 to 6 tags to really get a good sense of large carcasses. You can find about 95% of your elephant carcasses just with that small number of birds. Now, Ruaha is a fairly opened landscape, so that might be different in areas that are more forested, but this at least gives us an indication. You don't need a lot of birds because vultures aggregate at carcasses, and if there's a big carcass, many individuals are likely to show up there eventually. So in Tanzania, we've been using this ArcGIS tool, but when we started working in Kafue National Park, both Panthera and African Parks were interested in seeing this system move into EarthRanger. So we began tagging birds in October last year. We've now got 19 tagged birds across Kafue, so we've done north, central, and south. The vultures are already giving us really great information about connectivity within the greater Okavango, Zambezi, the Kaza landscape. So you can see how they move from Kafue down into Namibia and Botswana, where they spend a bit of time. So far, we haven't had any poisonings in Kafue, which is great, but we did have a mortality in Botswana, so it's starting to give us a sense of maybe where the threats are for vultures and other predators in this landscape. And then we've been using it for carcass detection. So the rest of the talk is going to be about this shift that we've made of moving the carcass detection into MoveApps, which is a really amazing tool. And cluster analysis in MoveApps is just one example of what it can do. And Andrea is very interested in hearing other ideas of how the system might be useful to people. So we used MoveApps to do the analysis. And then from MoveApps, the data can be communicated directly into EarthRanger in a real-time automated way so that you can visualize where are these potential feeding sites, and then people on the ground, which is where Andrea and Xia come in. They'll talk with you a little bit about then the implications for following up on those points. So I'm going to hand it off here to the first Andrea.
Thank you, Corinne. Okay, I'll try to do without coughing here. So I'm probably repeating the story a little bit from my side, so forgive me. When was it? Last year, this time? I was contacted by our MoveBank data curator, Sarah Davidson, and said, I have a nice use case for MoveBank, for MoveApps. Should I put you in contact? And we had just so MoveApps started in February last year, so we had just half a year to make the system kind of functional. So it was really a very good timing to get a real use case. And so I said, yes, let's go ahead. We even got a little bit of funding that Corinne organized with Wildlife Protection Solutions to actually implement this. That allowed us to put this really on the high priority list, so we could just go ahead directly and also make some changes to the system due to that, which was really helpful. So we spent several cross time zone discussions of what she would like and what's important, and got this tool into MoveApps. So for those of you who wonder what is the deal with MoveApps, what is this all about? So we have kind of started, I'm not sure, 12, 13 years ago, MoveBank was set up to store all this tracking data that people are using. It's a free tool. It's also meant for archiving, for sharing data easily with other people. We have a data repository where you can archive your data if you write a paper and need to share your data that way. There's live streams as in EarthRanger as well. And since 1.5 years now, MoveApps is part of it. It doesn't mean you need to have your data in MoveBank. It's much easier if you do, but you can also load just CSV files of tracks into MoveApps. and we allow to kind of publish also the code, which I think is a really nice way of recognizing the work of a coder, which usually is not the case so often. Okay, I've already told you much of this yesterday, and I'm sorry if you have to hear this again. So MoveApps was built to kind of release the work on those two people, one collecting data and being worried how to get it analyzed, and one wanting to make new analysis methods and developing them, but having to help this guy analyze the data, being really excited about it and being happy, but it's just too much. So we developed MoveApps kind of as an intermediary, and MoveApps now allows small R modules, we call them apps, to be submitted, and then anybody that is logging into it and has data can use these apps to analyze the data. And I will show you soon how we have done this with a cluster algorithm workflow that we've developed with Corinne. But just a small note of MoveApps. I got several questions yesterday. So it is a free thing. You can just go to the website, www.moveapps.org. You have to register though. We have over 500 users now, and there are 54 running apps, 20 public workflows, maybe a little bit more now. And it has all these nice, let's say, features that are actually super new. And I have been told that this is the future of the analyzing things on in the cloud, free for everybody, open source, so that the community can see the code of the apps and can improve it, and that you get recognition by publication. But having repeated that, I would like to show you the cluster detection workflow. So this is how it looks in MoveApps. If we have a little bit of time later on, we could also dare and make a live presentation of it. Let's see how it goes. So I think this workflow consists of 10 or 11 different apps, where the first one is to download data from MoveBank. If your data is coming in with a live feed into MoveBank from your animal, then it's directly being pulled into MoveApps. It's kind of near real time, which is, I think, a big advantage. Then we do all kinds of filtering things to really only look at the locations where the vultures were actually feeding. So where they were on the ground, meaning low speed, they only feed during the day, and we remove outliers, which is also possible. And then comes the nitty-gritty and kind of central part of the workflow. It's the point cluster detection app that we kind of put together back and forth. How can we best do that? So it basically, each location, so it's a multi-individual clustering. As Corinne has already said, that was really important for her. So each location gets a kind of a cluster radius that the user can adapt. So depending on the range of the animal around the carcass. And then whenever they overlap into clusters, like you see there on the right side, this is a cluster. We also check that there's a minimum duration that the animals are there. So if you have 3 spots of 3 locations that are just 3 seconds apart from each other, of course, this is possibly not a cluster. And in addition, sometimes you have gaps between the locations. They also should not be too large. So like if a vulture has been there today and it's again there in 3 months, that might not be a carcass. Very likely isn't. So then what MoveApps gives you, it's passing on the tracking data between the apps. That's so in MoveApps you can just kind of click on these files and download them. But it can also give you additional files. So this cluster app is giving you a table of the clusters and properties of these clusters. How big are they? How many animals have been on there? How long has it been used? How many revisits were there per individual, and so on. And all this data can be seen in EarthRanger, but that's the next step. Should not. Okay, and maybe a possibility of MoveApps. So we have implemented this kind of cluster algorithm because that's what Corinne's tool was doing before, so we can compare it. But there are other ways to cluster, of course, and if you think for your data set it's better to do it in another way, it's very easy just to take out that app and put another one in, and you have a different kind of analysis. What MoveApps allows is to have these workflows run in a scheduled manner automatically. So you can set up, for example, here to have this workflow run daily, every day at 6 o'clock, and you can get a notification by email, either just a notification, or you can select which of the files you want to have attached in your email, which is maybe a little bit of a security issue if you're working with rhinos, I guess, but you can decide that yourself, so you don't have to get this data into your email, and then one can open the file. Corinne was not so happy with having to open a file every morning, so we made another thing. So we added an email alert app, which is added to the workflow, so you can just add like a long line of apps. So there the user can say which property is important for me, and here we said, okay, if the number of individuals, so that's n.ids, is greater than 1, I want to be kind of have a notification in the email, and there I can even give it the text cluster with at least 2 animals, and then you would get this email with this notification here, with a little bit of the data that are fulfilling this property, and even in the subject of the email it will be said, your alert has been set. So if you look at the email, you don't have to open it, you see something is happening, and you can then open it or don't open it. After a while, it became apparent that this was still not enough. So Corinne teamed us up with EarthRanger, and it was really nice to see that it actually works, that somebody else makes an app and puts it there. So Jess did that and was rather successful, I think. So that now all the cluster data is being streamed into EarthRanger directly when the workflow is running. So you have the data coming in kind of live once per day, I guess, into MoveBank. Then you have to see that you maybe time it up right to start this workflow always an hour after the data is coming into MoveBank, the new data from the day. Then run it. It runs maybe 10 minutes or something. And then you directly get your email, you directly get a push to EarthRanger, and you can send out your people into the field if there's a big cluster. Just to add this a little bit, so Corinne already said there's a MoveBank integration with EarthRanger, so you can see the full tracks, even on top of the clusters or underneath them. And yeah, we would like to kind of extend a bit also the possibilities of integration between EarthRanger and MoveBank. So we are hoping to kind of also allow data from EarthRanger being pushed to MoveBank for archiving data and sharing and analyzing them afterwards, which I think is a great potential that this data is around. And I think with that, I give the floor to Xia.
Cool. So my name is Xia Stevens. I'm from Panthera. And like Andrea from African Parks, we are based in Kafue National Park in Zambia. So I'm just going to set the context a little bit and talk a little bit about the integration that we set up with these guys in EarthRanger. And then Andrea's going to take over some more context about what we're going to do going forward with the vulture clusters. So Kafue National Park is in central Zambia. It's approximately 22,000 square kilometers. It's actually a lot more than that with the GMAs. And we're using EarthRanger between several organizations on the ground to track assets and our real-time monitoring and that type of thing. So we started with the vulture clusters about a year ago now, when Corinne came to site, and they had this fantastic cluster analysis already, and we thought this would be a fantastic way to identify carcasses on the ground in Kafue. We didn't have a lot of aerial assets at the time in Kafue, so this was a really fantastic way of finding carcasses and information in those areas that we weren't necessarily able to access via the roads and that type of thing. And we just wanted to add that extra layer of protection on top of all the work we're doing as well. Coming from a carnivore organization, really, really interesting to see the connection between vulture clusters and the carnivores that are using those. So many different use cases, and I think most of us in this room probably know about them anyway. But yeah, basically, I know you've kind of already seen this, but the integration with EarthRanger has just made it a lot easier to visualize the amazing work that these guys have done already with building the cluster algorithms. And the tagging of the vultures and figuring out those algorithms and things, which obviously are not easy to figure out. So what we did with Jess is really like talk through the situation that we had and how EarthRanger and using EarthRanger to visualize those clusters would really help us. So as you can see on the screen with the EarthRanger, all of the clusters have a priority rating, which really, really helps us, and it really helps us on the screen that it's easily visualized. So obviously your clusters that are in red are your high priority clusters, and then in green are clusters but maybe not so high priority. This was really important because there's a lot of clusters that pop up. You can see this is just like one tiny section of Kafue National Park, and this is clusters for the last 30 days. So there's so many clusters. So it was really important for us to be able to prioritize which clusters we're going to go and see and prioritize our resources and our effort to do that. So basically, based on priority, we would then go and ground truth them on the ground, either by our like monitoring ground teams or by the aircraft help from African Parks. And then based on that, we then in EarthRanger can resolve those clusters. So we can go back to the same event report and we can add in what we saw, whether we saw an elephant carcass, whether we saw a nest, whatever we saw. And then what happens is on the back end is that Corinne and her team can pull out all of that data to make sure that the clusters are still aligning with the correct algorithms that they've made. So if it was a red high priority cluster, was it in fact on the ground a high priority cluster? One of the biggest challenges we've had with this is just getting to all the clusters, the manpower for the clusters, and to get to them has always been a bit of an issue, especially in the rainy season when you can't get out to a lot of these. And that's where the aircraft help and assistance has been really vital. Yeah, so for us on the ground to date, it's been really fantastic. We've found a lot of large carcasses through this. And also in some areas where we expected to see more large carcasses, I think we found a lot less carcasses than what we would think to have found, which is really great news for Kafue. So that's how we've been using it to date, and now I'm going to hand over to Andrea, who's going to explain how we're going to use it going forward.
Hi everybody, I'm Andrea Reid. I work at African Parks and I'm the Special Projects Manager based in Kafue, and I'm just going to share a few key management implications of the vulture clusters that we'll use going forward. So obviously, it's very obvious to everybody that we're going to continue using this for ecological monitoring. So identifying wildlife mortality events, nest sites, quite important in Kafue because we have quite a severe fire issue in Kafue. So if these nest sites will be able to implement management actions, don't burn in an area, or if there's arson fires, we can quickly act in that. And then as Corinne mentioned earlier, just understanding the connectivity between the vulture population, identifying the foraging sites, where areas are of high risk and that. And then vulture mortality beacons, obviously we'll, use this for, just for us to develop a good knowledge base on the ground in Kafue about, are vultures struck by lightning or, whatever. And then quite important to us is that we will be using this for law enforcement. So these cluster alerts will lead to aerial vehicle foot checks, and then through this we'll be able to react or not depending on whatever cluster comes up. Will help these, as Corinne mentioned, a lot of the stuff that's already mentioned, but it's, we'll find poaching camps, snaring lines, both active, abandoned snare lines. Also quite importantly, we'll be able to cross-reference this with known collars and on the land. I mean, if you do get say a large cluster and there's a collared lion there and that's been there for a few days, it's possible that maybe the lion's killed the buffalo or something like that. So, and then large carcass detections, both natural and illegal, elephant poaching. Thankfully in Kafue at the moment, touch wood, poaching is low, But then one of the big issues that we do find is because Kafui is so large, we aren't everywhere, and we don't want like any natural mortalities that occur. We don't want any theft from, say, a natural mortality, then that ivory lands up in the illegal market. And then again, the vulture mortality beacons with possible targeted sites. At least we'll be able to get to those areas quickly and react, and so to preventing other animals from dying. So there were some initial findings from the Panthera EarthRanger system. Just going through it briefly, from these cluster detections we found 2 elephants, a buffalo, a giraffe, a letwe in Zambia. In Botswana, Namibia, and Angola, 85 points shared. There were 33 points checked with the 39%. Out of this, there were 23 elephant carcasses, one in Namibia, then all the others in Botswana, which was possibly linked to an anthrax outbreak, which in September. There was also 2 giraffe and 1 letwe in Namibia carcass. Sort of going forward, there is obviously a lot of concerns for us in Kafui, and as Corinne mentioned earlier, we haven't noticed any targeting of these sentinel vultures through poisoning. So, going forward, we feel operational secrecy in terms of this project is required, and we're going to have to be really careful what social media is out there already and what is actually being reported from the park. So, thank you from all of us.
And so we're looking for sites to work with us on that. It's always best. Great, thank you. It's always best to develop things when you have real examples, real users to work with. So please do let us know if anyone's interested in that. The second is that that MoveApp step that takes data from MoveApps and sends it to EarthRanger actually has nothing to do with the cluster project. So any sort of analysis that you want to do in MoveApps and then push the results of that into EarthRanger will work through that integration. So we hope that people will use that to do lots of interesting things with MoveApps. And the third was very, very little of the actual technical implementation that you saw has anything to do with vultures. So obviously this is a fantastic use case, a fantastic example, but we're using the exact same approach right now to study cougar movement in Washington, puma movement in Chile, that is uncovering things about their lifestyle and their what's happening to them. So we're actually, with amazing accuracy, able to predict cougar cubs, which is pretty cool. And so please do think through your projects, and if there's any additional ways that this approach can help, we're happy to assist in that. Q&A.
Thanks very much. It's actually great because I sent Bruce an email the other day to say we have a livestock project just outside where EWT has got a whole bunch of vulture data and wild dog data, and I said, how do we collaborate? So my question to you is it better to go to the Move Bank side and ask for the request to come through to our EarthRanger there, or can you do EarthRanger to EarthRanger sharing for a specific area? Like I don't necessarily need to know when there's vultures descending inside the Kruger National Park, but when they're outside. So should it be like a geofence and then the alert comes to me? I just want to try and figure out that.
Yeah, so the MoveApp side is really brilliantly implemented. So although I'm sure they're happy to hear about the projects and help, it's possible to set up these workflows without any assistance. The EarthRanger side does require a little bit of configuration and setup. So I'm happy to be a point of contact, but then pull in and Corinne and others just so they know that their amazing work is being used for great things.
I'll also just add, so Jeff Quinning from African Parks is helping us kind of think through how we might do that, because there's multiple partners working not just in Kafui but also across Zambia doing similar things, and so we've been thinking about how to make that work most effectively. There's a few different possible approaches. One might be developing of a clipping tool in MoveApps, so you would clip out only the clusters that are relevant for your area, and then only those would be communicated to your EarthRanger, but then all the clusters would be communicated to the main site. That also might come through EarthRanger, so sort of you'll see where the code comes from, but those would be two. That would be one way to do it, and that could be done on either side. So, and then I think as the EarthRanger to EarthRanger integration improves, the clusters can be treated like individuals. So just as you could, if you only wanted to share 2 of your elephants that you know roam outside the park, you could also share only the clusters, only the birds that are using outside the park, or only the clusters that appear outside the park. So as that moves forward, that'll be another way to handle this.
Thank you all for this presentation of this wonderful work. I'm interested in multi-species contact, and so I was wondering how the clustering handles potentially different tags, as well as if there's different fixed frequencies, can you place kind of buffers around the frequencies of points coming in? Does that make sense?
I'll let Andrea fill in if I'm missing anything. But yeah, so we've been starting to think about those things as well. I think for multi-species, you could run the cluster across 3 lions, 5 hyenas, and 10 vultures, and you would see where clustering occurred that could be cross, of a group of those. So it's definitely possible. And again, if you wanted that auto-populated into EarthRanger, you could set it up that way so that those would be the clusters that you'd know. And in the cluster tool, when you open up the report, it tells you which tags were associated with that cluster. So you would be able to then decipher, okay, this cluster was 3 vultures, this cluster was a lion, a hyena, and a vulture. So the possibilities are there, and there's so many sites now with multi-species, and so it's something I think about a lot that we haven't done yet. In terms of differences in data frequency, Andrew's already helped us work with that. So with some partners in Masai Mara, we're looking at how we can bring data together. In Masai Mara, you can use GSM, so you get much higher frequency than what we can get in southern Tanzania, where we're using satellite. And so she's developed a way that you can pull out the time. What are you doing?
I mean, it was an idea. I don't know if it will work. We will have to see. So what we've done to give locations of high frequency less power or less significance in this analysis was to give each location a time lag until the next location. So kind of a duration that you attach to the location. And then sum this up in the cluster. So if you had a cluster where you had 5 locations of this high resolution and 2 locations of this lower resolution, you would, the 5 locations of the high resolution would not have as much as an impact on your kind of sum duration. I think that's helpful. It might be a bit problematic if you have gaps of data, but you will see that because in each cluster you also see the number of locations that are making up this cluster.
Okay,
That's
that makes sense. Thank you so much.
And just one thing to add to that is EarthRanger also has a subject-to-subject proximity analyzer. And so if you have 2 types of subjects, and they can be either the same species or different species, and you can configure if they get within so many meters of each other within so many hours, then it'll create an event that occurred. That's actually how we're predicting the cougar cubs that I mentioned. Is if two cougars, one male, one female, come, are next to each other, and 3 months later, we can then use the cluster detection to detect the cubs.
Hey, thank you guys. Really exciting stuff. I was curious, so I'm just curious about the sort of logistical side of having like a global or a continental vulture watch program. And the ER could be the house that and partition it so you only get local data. Is that at all feasible, or is it just the politics and are you guys putting that through, or I guess what's happening?
I think there's a lot of interest in moving in that direction. There's several groups that are using vultures this way, and and there's discussions kind of ongoing of how we could collaborate and create something multi-site. We've already, last year we completed a study that had vulture movement from 34 different researchers and a number of different sites across the continent that we used to look at variation in home range size for different parts of Africa. So I think there's that desire to collaborate, and I'm hopeful that we'll kind of reach that point.
Yeah, and then I was just going to say, so there's immobility alert feature in ER already that's based on clustering, but it's temporal clustering. So the frequency with which the fixes come in doesn't really matter. It's just probabilistic. If you have, fixes in the same place within a certain amount of time, at some point you get high probability that you're dealing with immobility. So if you have a bunch of, you have 50 fixes every second, and it's less than a minute, that would be very low probability that that's an immobility event. Right? If you have 50 fixes spread out over 8 hours, that becomes, the fixed number, I guess, is irrelevant. It's the sort of aggregate time, it's sort of how Jay's done.
Well, that's basically what Andrea has done. So she's set it up so that if you're getting different frequencies, rather than, because with just our data alone, with one set of frequencies, we just look at the number of points that show up, and that's indicative of what might be happening. But you need to start looking at the duration, but it's not the total duration at that location, it's the duration between the points that are at that location. So that's what Andrea has helped to set up for that. Yeah, I mean, the other component to this that's different is that it's not for single individuals, so you're getting multiple individuals taken into account with this.
That's fantastic. I hope you need to do a vulture breeding program. Just like this reliance on vultures is amazing, and their service is incredible, but it's really scary, I mean, everybody knows about vultures. So like not releasing it on Snapchat everybody already knows. So it's a really tough situation.
Yeah, the sentinel poisoning thing is, obviously we worry about that a lot, and it's tricky because we don't want to provide more motivation for that, but at the same time, sentinel poisoning is already happening without tagged birds. So it's already a concern. Fortunately, it doesn't seem to be something every person poaching elephants is doing, but it certainly has the ramifications to wipe out entire species very quickly if it did. So hopefully, as we address both poaching and poisoning, we can better protect vultures and other species.
Thank you.
First of all, I think it's one of the best uses of technology that I've heard here. I think it's really got a lot of potential. In terms of the security around it, that's definitely a concern. I think it can be turned around that if you actually can get very rapid alerts in, also that currently your approach is, it seems like a lot of the analysis is happening on the server, but if you can do that analysis based on accelerometers or whatever on the edge, so it's actually triggering alarms on the bird as it happens, you can maybe even turn it around so it's saying like there's only one thing that's worse than having a group of vultures flying over your carcass, that's actually killing one of them, because now you really get the ranges on your tail. So maybe actually by making this system very rapidly responding, you should go public with it and saying like if you put poison out there, then you will get ranges on your tail very, very quickly.
I think we are out of time. I mean, probably we're gonna have one last question.
Thanks. Hey guys, it's amazing to hear all of this stuff, and I've been talking to Corinne a lot, and I'm super excited about this and what it means, and just sort of following up on the clustering and how we could potentially overlay that with known poisoning hotspots and things like that, like to enhance maybe predictive quality of the work. So you know that they cluster and they forage in these areas, you know that these areas might be poisoning hotspots. And so just getting all of that kind of data in, I think will be really useful in terms of how we can take things forward. And putting my sort of my bird life hat off and my lion guardian's hat on, I'm trying to think about how we can use this for human-wildlife conflict and tolerance and clustering on those things, because we do monthly sort of predictive things, thinking about hotspots and what we should do. So more on the prevention side, but amazing work, and I'm super excited about where this can go.
You know, that's a great comment, and actually I'll just follow that up with Natasha Peters, the PhD student we've been working with, actually has a paper coming out soon and still in review, but that looks at exactly that. So using what we know about where the vultures are feeding, with what we know about where poisoning is most likely to take place, to then highlight for us in Tanzania where should we focus our efforts on addressing poisoning. And I think similarly you could use this analysis to look at where birds are foraging outside the park, and if those aren't places where you expect there to be a lot of wildlife, that could be indicative maybe of predation or other issues that are happening. So I definitely think there are a vast number of implications of this sort of technology.